Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Pat Garrett, and I'd like to welcome you to Technion's The Greatness of Tableau webinar series. Today's webinar is being presented by Technion's own Tableau Zen Master, Brigitte Cogley, and she will be discussing the very interesting topic of the linguistics of data visualization. Today's webinar is scheduled to run from noon until 1 p.m. Central, and we'll be sure to honor your time today by ending the formal presentation before 1 p.m. And for those of you who would like to remain on the webinar and ask Bridget a few questions, we will be keeping the webinar session open for another 10 to 15 minutes after the presentation for a Q&A session. We invite as many of you as would like to stay for this interactive time together. Before we get started, I'd like to briefly tell you a little bit about Technion Data Solutions. Technion is a technology consulting firm specializing in business intelligence, data management, and advanced analytics. Business leaders typically engage Technion if they desire to implement a self-service analytics platform because traditional analytics processes have just proven too slow, or maybe they've invested in Tableau but simply don't quite know how to get the most out of it and roll it out successfully to the organization. Technion offers a full suite of consulting services, including BI strategy, leadership, data integration, data visualization, data analytics, product and skills training, and custom application development. We augment our consulting by reselling leading-edge tools like Tableau, Squarescape, and Alteryx to address our customers' most common BI needs, and we offer cloud hosting services to make implementation fast, easy, and cost-effective. Technion is a Tableau Gold partner, and we love data. We love Tableau, and we are passionate about helping our clients unlock the truth and insight hidden in their data using Tableau. That's what we do. So with that, let's get going with today's webinar. Please allow me to introduce our speaker, Brigitte Cogley. Brigitte is a Technion and Tableau consultant, and she is also one of only 27 Tableau Zen Masters in the world. Zen Master is the highest accolade granted for excellence and engagement with Tableau. Brigitte was also designated a Tableau Social Ambassador for her extensive involvement in the Tableau community. Brigitte lives in Ohio with her husband and 4-year-old son, and now I'll turn it over to her to get started.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for joining today. So this webinar is focused on the linguistics of data visualization. This is a presentation that I did share at the Tableau conference that did occur a couple months ago. And so without much further ado, I'll jump right in. If you'd like to have a conversation on Twitter about this, you're welcome to use the TAskData hashtag. This is the same one we also used during the conference. So you can find me on Twitter at Brigitte Cogley, and you can also tag Technion VS as well. So moving forward, what is my background and why linguistics? So to give you kind of an idea, I started my career as an interpreter, specifically focused on American Sign Language. Due to this rigorous training, I've got a background in linguistics, specifically focusing on visual gestural language. So that's how we classify sign languages. One of probably the coolest things that I got to experience, though, as I was learning sign language was seeing the birth of a language out in Nicaragua. And I'll actually talk a little bit more in detail about that in just a few seconds. I was also a certified interpreter for a number of years as well. So definitely very strong in the interpreting background. Moving on, one of the coolest things I got to see was Nicaragua. A lot of times we will take a sign language and, if you will, import it to another country. With this, we had a bunch of deaf children go into a deaf school, and they created their own language. Now, this doesn't happen. It's very rare for spontaneous language to occur in modern society. Typically, we hear more about language death, not so much language birth. So when this happened, a bunch of researchers booked it, documented it. It was widely discussed. Everybody was fascinated because it really gave us insight into how language is created and how new languages are created and born. And so some of this does play into my presentation. I know it seems probably way off right now, but at some point this will tie in. What was really key from this was as the first generation got together, they started communicating. They didn't necessarily have linguistic constructs, but they had ways to communicate wants, desires, things that they were thinking about. when they brought in the second generation, only a few years after the first generation, they took these signs and communicative forms and actually turned them into a language within one generation. So really, really neat, really proves that the human brain is wired for language. And so with that in mind, somehow I made it into data visualization. It's a long story, but ultimately I did go from interpreting and then through a startup into data analytics. And surprisingly enough, I did find that the skills transferred quite easily. Now, as I was working through my journey, one of the things I ran into was, okay, well, I make good dashboards, but how do I make better dashboards? How do I make dashboards where I can put them in front of a user and they can instantaneously understand what I'm attempting to convey? Because again, coming from an interpreting background, that was my job. I was responsible for the communication, and so that was truly on me. And so I wanted to bring this type of idea, this type of accessibility to dashboard design. And I said, okay, well, what is a dashboard? When we talk about dashboards, what does that mean? And so one of the most common definitions that we hear is that from Stephen Pugh. And we hear over and over, you know, the dashboard is a visual display of the most important information needed to achieve one or more objectives. Well, what does that mean? So I looked at that, and to me, I pulled out the following words: visual, relevant, actionable. Because to me, it's not just enough to have it sit there. You're looking to do something with this. The other part of this is consolidated and arranged on a single screen. So there's something where you're synthesizing it, and it's also focused. And then so that the information can be monitored at a glance. So this is a view. This isn't the end-all, be-all. This is simply a view. Now, the one thing I didn't hear and that I didn't get is that a dashboard is also communication. So if you look at communicating with your audience, that's the thing that I felt was kind of missing from this. And so I said to myself, okay, well, if a dashboard is communication, who communicates well? And I went on this journey, and one of the things I found that, you know, okay, looked through Tableau Public, and I said, okay, well, who communicates well? And I found a person by the name of Kelly Martin, also a Tableau Zen Master, and found that she communicated very well. And so I actually have a sample of one of her dashboards that really spurned a lot of this, and I'm not alone in this fascination. You can actually see out on Tableau Public, which if you've not been to Tableau Public, this is a phenomenal resource to use. You can literally find thousands of samples out there for free, and for the most part, you can download them and reverse engineer them. So I highly recommend, if you've never been on Tableau Public, check out Tableau Public. The other thing, as I looked at a lot of her work, I found, yes, it's consistent. So to me, that said that something else was going on here. It wasn't just, hey, I'm communicating well, but that perhaps, maybe, just maybe, there was a language here. And so I ripped it apart, and I used what I call parameters, which is a concept borrowed from American Sign Language linguistics, to begin to describe what I feel is a linguistic phenomenon. Now, we'll actually jump into this deeper, because I'm sure you, like me, are probably squinting at your screen and going, well, what is this? Well, first, what is a language? So we talk about language, and a lot of times people think language equals speech. That's not fair. So one of the definitions that I pulled from my program is that of Baker, Schenck, and Cogley, and it's that a language is a system of relatively arbitrary symbols and grammatical signals. So when we say arbitrary symbols, a sign can be an arbitrary symbol, a word can be an arbitrary symbol. Could a chart be an arbitrary symbol? And grammatical signals. So when I look at grammatical signals, the way I place my chart potentially could be grammar, because there is, to me, a right and a wrong way to place them. That changes, you know, and that changes across time. So I've got some historical dashboards here. You can see lots more lines, lot more annotations. We don't typically do anymore. To see that we have actually watched this change. If you want to be very fancy for dinner tonight, the actual formal word is diachronic process. Definitely great for dinner time trivia. And then finally, that used for several purposes: to interact with each other, to communicate ideas, emotions, intents, and to transmit their culture from generation to generation. And so you can see, for example, I've actually got a dashboard here. I can pull that up and we can look at that one closer later, but it transmits ideas and culture. So with that in mind, we've kind of said, okay, there could potentially be a language here. Let's really look at this at play. And so when I tore apart Kelly Martin's dashboard, again, not my dashboard, but I just looked at this and said, okay, this is really powerful, but why? And so when I looked at the whole dashboard, you'll notice there's not a lot of color on this. There's just a small focus area with color. And if you look at the actual process or progression, you can see that it does seem to follow, to me, a very logical format for time. So you've got daytime being in a bright yellow, down to nighttime being in more of a blue. And then also there's matching of the metrics. So they're differentiated. So you can see here's number versus kind of that time element. Finally, there seems to be a UX or a flow to this. So you've got this very, very large map that almost screams to me, hey, look here. And so your signal to click on this map, and it filters throughout the entire dashboard. And then, again, because this dashboard is done in English, it does follow that left-to-right interaction that we're pretty familiar with as English speakers. The next was shape. And as I look through here, in particular, the most compelling thing to me was kind of this crash symbol. So you look at this kind of, here's this crash. It's almost like the Batman cow. And so I kind of went, well, this seems to almost be universal. And I went and I looked, and you can even see on my icon, that same type of shape is there. So there is an almost universality with that particular shape. You've got other shapes such as the map and the animals. And the other thing is, I don't have Canada or Mexico or other parts of the continent on this particular map. It really is limited to just the topic, which is the United States. With the movement, as I kind of looked through this and kind of monitored where my eyes went as much as I could, I did notice that I really was pulled to this tiny focal point up here. So I've got a lot of stuff just really building to this one spot. It's got a really nice arc upwards. But then the final piece of this was I kind of looked at it, and then I started drawing lines because I was kind of trying to understand how is this put together. And this was the part that really surprised me because there is an element of the golden ratio in here, but there's just a lot of parallels within sight lines. So it's a really neat trick that really makes a difference. And we'll see a little bit more of that in play later. So with this in mind, I said, okay, well, I see it. Now, how do I use it? My opportunity came from social media where there had been kind of a solicited call to, well, hey, we've got this dashboard. So Tableau made this beautiful dashboard #1. Got feedback from the community that, yes, it's very pretty to look at, but is it meaningful? And so they went through and did round 2. But then they asked the community, well, how would you do it differently? And so I downloaded this. I did some experiments. And I guess you can say that's when the lightning struck for me. And so I ended up making this dashboard. And if you look, it does contain a number of elements from the original dashboard. So I've got things like the heat map, the stack bar chart, the map itself have all remained consistent. There's a few changes that I made, and we'll go into the details of what and why. And so this is the actual dashboard. And if I click here on California, or I could click any other state if I wanted to, you see that the whole thing filters. That was actually already built within the dashboard. I didn't realize it until after I had actually built this, went through a whole thought process around potentially making my sales and profit a filter. And then I just made the mistake of clicking on the state, and I went, oh, the whole thing filters. So for me, I added this visual cue that said, hey, click here. So this is kind of this dashboard in a nutshell. Using the linguistic model, we are going to actually talk about this a bit more in depth, about kind of the changes I made. So if I use user interface or user flow, the first thing I did was I tried to really make certain things uniform. So for example, my titles, I have uppercase all the way. I put this gray title bar, and I really kind of put things in their own little categories. So the filters are up here. The labels are up here. It's all in one tidy spot. You've got continuity with titles. I did put a slight hue in. It just, to me, it felt needed. And then also, again, just to call back out to that map and say, hey, click here. Again, partly because I didn't realize that, and so just trying to make this so that I could use it. So the next part of this, if we look at shape, For example, this is a dual axis chart, and I did get feedback at one point, and we'll actually see this experiment about, well, it shouldn't be synchronized. Maybe you should have it asynchronous so you can see both trends better. So we'll actually take a look at that in a later part so you can see what that looks like. I've also got the KPI at the end. And for me, what I wanted to focus on with this profit by category was the big drop. I did not notice that in the original. And so by putting it here, it really called out to me that something went awry. And that way I was able to see it. The other thing was I knocked out a lot of the detail on the map, partly because it was very distracting in the original. I was a little confused by, okay, where's this, what's this? And then again, just putting some of those KPIs with it, and then moving into sales and profit. And we'll talk a little bit more about that decision-making process as well through some of these experiments. And then the other thing is we often hear about things like Z-reading. And so Z-reading is a very common phenomenon in English-speaking countries. Basically, we take our eyes from one chart over here, so that ultimately this corner here is really not desirable. The other thing is you've got a lot of flow and movement at the top. You've got this kind of being reinforced by the legend. And then I've got this huge map that ultimately, once you do your initial pass-through, you're kind of drawn back here because this is very large, and because you go, okay, well, here's this thing. Maybe I click on it. And then as you continue to look and explore this dashboard, you do kind of find this other little section here, if you will, which is all profit. And so you start to kind of say, okay, well, here's kind of the monthly view, and then here's more of the annual breakdown. And you can start to kind of spot trends. Now, placement is one of these topics that I won't lie, it's fairly hard to illustrate, but what I've done is I've set this up in such a way, and later experiments will make this a bit easier to see. It's a little hard to see it without those experiments, I won't lie. But you can kind of see how everything lines up in a particular fashion. We'll play with moving that and see what moving that does. But again, I have created several relationships just by the way I've set these up and placed them. Now, color is one of those things we hear about a lot. And so you sometimes hear that color can make or break a dashboard. And we're actually going to look into that. We're going to see a lot of different examples with color. And a lot of people also tell me they're not good at color. I usually disagree with most people. So what I did here was I tried to use blue for sales. So as you look through, these bars are sales, and then this heat map is also sales. And I've tried to use kind of this teal-green family for profit. Again, just some visual cues to support that, and then gray for amount. So this is just an entirely different metric, so it doesn't match these guys. So it's really just trying to find ways to signal at a glance what's going on here. And so with that in mind, Andy Warhol had soup cans, and so what I have is this dashboard. And so what I've done is I've taken this same dashboard, and I've just done a lot of experiments, because to me, you know, I had these parameters, but were they real? Did they exist? And so you're going to see this dashboard. You're going to get very, very, very tired of this dashboard. But I needed to prove to myself that it's not just throwing charts on a dashboard, that there really is meaning and potentially grammar to this. So if you're not tired of this dashboard yet, I'll apologize now, because I am going to run through probably more experiments than one person should with a dashboard. So with that, I present you Andy Warhol #1. And so the first thing we'll focus on is user interface. So kind of just thinking of this almost like either a web application or software or things like that. So if you logged into LinkedIn this morning, you got quite the shocker. And that's kind of what we're playing here, is just if I change the interface, what does this look like, and what does that mean? And so one way to change the interface would be to change the actions. So I could put the actions on the time element or on other elements. I chose instead to really focus on this title bar, because I felt like it offered me something interesting. So all I did was drag this title bar down. I did darken the charts behind it, and I ended up reversing some text just to make it legible. But you can see how you really get locked in on this going across. So you go across, but then it just becomes harder to jump down. And I've really lost that relationship between profit by category and profit contribution. So I've broken it up. And to me, I have a hard time overcoming that wall. So that was kind of experiment number one. The other thing I did is I said, okay, well, let me return this title bar back. And again, kind of have this emphasis here. So I've got this emphasis across. But then it really is, again, still hard for me to make the connection from profit down. So I've created buckets, if you will. So the next thing I said is, okay, well, that relationship, I keep going back to where that profit relationship is very important. And so I went ahead and I stuck it in its own bucket. Well, now my focus comes over here in part because this is darker. And I kind of lose this. It creates a little container here. I lose my Z reading entirely because I kind of, to me, bounce on this wall to the map, to the heat map, and then over here. So it's kind of an unusual flow for me. And if you look on my blog, I've actually gone through and tried to trace these patterns as well. So you can kind of see, okay, here's where this is going. So that's that modular setup. And again, continuing to experiment with that modular setup just to see, okay, well, how can I change this? How can I play with this some more? I did lighten it up. Still have the wall with it, I won't lie. So I've at least brought the title back out so it doesn't feel a little vintage, but then I'm still running into this where I make a V and then I go down. So to me, again, this was interesting. Going back to the original and just seeing kind of what the original looks like again after seeing this experiment. I definitely wanted to leave it open. So you can see how this is open, but yet you're still directed to make some of these relationships with your eye. So that is UI and flow. I do use some of those modular setups for other dashboards, particularly when I'm using it to highlight actions. And I've got other dashboards I can show to illustrate that. Moving on to shape. Sometimes when we talk about shape, we talk about charts. And so when you look at shape, this isn't just the charts, but this is also how the charts play within the dashboard. So you look at, for example, with shape, I went ahead and I actually took this profit by category and I changed it to a line. So we're still using best practice. But what we're doing is we're changing how we're looking at the data. We're changing some of the meaning within the data. So I can still see that drop. I'm not seeing them as a combined effort. So if I wanted to look at profit by comparison, this would be one way to do it versus seeing it as a combined total. You'll notice, though, that now I've lost my visual anchor. So as I scroll through this dashboard, I still kind of have this cross, but this is very light, so I do lose some of that natural urge to go up and down. So continuing to play with some of these ideas of how can I change the look and feel of this, I went ahead and I actually took that feedback of, well, okay, well, if I don't synchronize the axis, what does this look like? Well, if I don't synchronize the axis, then I've got to call out which axis belongs to what so that you don't make an assumption of, oh, well, this is, a particular amount, or, oh, wow, this looks very extreme. So I had to call them out. Some people do this by actually coloring the axis bars different colors. For me, it created too much of a wall, so I actually made the text the different colors. It may still be hard to see, especially going over GoToMeeting and everything. So that is one way to do it. What also happened, though, was it did still create a wall to me. And then I had to put the legend, and I had to move these over a little bit more. So it didn't feel as good to me. So it really, for me, justified my original choice of having it set up the way I did. So moving on, what if I split these two items up? And so I went ahead and I split them up, and you'll notice that we are getting closer and closer to how this was originally built. So in some ways, I'm almost reverse engineering this. And so now, with these three at the top, I have a lot of movement. I've got a lot of these dips and valleys and dips and valleys at the top. And so it felt like a lot was going on at the top. It also makes it very hard for me to compare profit versus sales. I've gotten a lot of hovering and go, okay, this number is this number is this. So it didn't feel very efficient to me. Definitely gives you a clear picture of each individual element, but to compare the two together, to understand I may have had high sales one month, but low profit, I'm not able to do that relationship. So to me, this defended why I had them together. And again, just moving closer towards the original, since we're well on our way to how this was originally built, I just wanted to kind of play with this. So I actually reverted the profit chart back to the stack bar chart like it also was before. And so now you can see that. You do actually see that dip with the colors that I chose. With the original, I believe this was a very light color, so it did get lost. So you see that it still feels like a lot going on at the top, and then you do lose some of your relationships here. And so just for fun, I went ahead and I said, okay, well, let me make it exactly like the original. So this actually throws in two different parameters together. This throws in both shape, but also a little bit around movement as well. And so this is what the original looks like, if you will, with my adapted formatting. So using my colors, using my placement, this is what this could look like. So it's formatted, but it follows some linguistic principles. Other than, to me, it really didn't make sense to have my thing driving the action in the middle, because then I click on this, and I have to do this U around experience. Now, I like when I have this set up kind of for my monitors, where I've got 5 or 6 different monitors around me, and I feel like I've got a command station. I don't find it very successful with the dashboard, because it really is a lot of perusing about. So another big reason why I did move that map over. Just to remind you, so this is kind of that pre-makeover look, and then moving into the original. And so again, this is kind of how my makeover really ended, was just kind of playing, putting these bars here, putting this map here to open it up, but also to signal to a lot of English speakers, hey, this is going to do something, this is important. So this gives you an idea of the shape. You can kind of see how they flow inside each other, they flow together. So with this in mind, let's look at movement. So when I talk about movement, this is kind of how you move through the dashboard, as well as kind of how your eyes navigate it as well. And so I went ahead and said, okay, well, if I split the top and the bottom, so this was originally on the top, this was originally on the bottom. If I just flip these, now I've got the state, so I click on this, and the interaction is right at the uppermost corner. That's a good way to look at this, right? My only challenge is, I won't lie, typically I do put kind of this time level overview at the top. I'm also pushing my KPI down towards the bottom. So I am losing, to me, information that sets the tone of this dashboard. So it didn't necessarily make sense for me in this particular view to have some really important information that sets the tone down here. So I continued to play with this. What I did is I flipped these two items back, so then it almost creates a wall. So now I've got this wall created of, here's the amount, here's sales trends, here's my sales trends KPI, I've got this wall, and then I've got my profit category. So I had a lot of this kind of reading, okay, and then through here, didn't feel very comfortable. And then I decided to kind of go for gold here, and I moved profit over to the left-hand side. So I've got this bucket category over here, and then I've got my action in the middle. So again, I'm running into a little bit of the command station effect, where I've got my action in the middle. And then while I really like this dip right into the map, it just looks cool right here. While I know there's usually an emphasis on profit in a number of businesses, they usually want to set the tone first with, well, how are sales doing, and then look at profit. So from an actual practice perspective, it didn't make sense. It made some cool shapes, but it just, in the end, I don't feel that this would be very useful for my clients. So again, back to the original. The other thing is, I do knock probably my most important KPI in the corner that way as well. So again, kind of here's the original after seeing kind of those variations. Now, placement is something that, to me, even took me a little bit to really understand. But it's kind of those crosshairs. How do I line everything up? So what I did is I started just moving stuff around. How do I make and create relationships? So I just scooted this over. So it definitely supports this V, kind of V across. But then I had a hard time kind of doing this up and down relationship because this is scooted over. It also breaks this relationship a little bit. It's still there, but it's a lot weaker. And also doesn't create very tidy lines. And so I know some of us, we kind of go through and we really try to make some tidy lines as we do dashboards. So I wanted to, in my second experiment, reestablish some tidy lines. And so I went ahead and just moved a couple things around again a little bit more, just to create a nice line down again. So I've got this line, and to me it almost isolates this piece from this piece. And so now I've got sales rolling into profit, and I've created my box over here and less over here. And continuing with these experiments, I went ahead and just moved the KPIs up. So again, we typically do these KPIs. This is a dashboard many of us have actually probably made in some ways, where we put KPIs at the top. We've got kind of our lines and everything. And so again, what this does is it creates a relationship here that really doesn't exist. So I've got this sales completely split from this part over here. So I've almost got two dashboards now, or two sections within the dashboard. And then another thing I've heard is, well, why, all of these dashboards you've seen so far have been set floating. Well, what about tiles? You can certainly do this model with tiles. I will say it is a bit harder, and you've got to do a little bit more finagling. And so I went ahead and just did a quick version that was tiled as well to kind of show this. And so this is a tiled version. So you can see I went ahead and kept the KPI up at the top. I kept the broken relationship. You'll notice that my map is a lot smaller. And so I also lined it up by the containers. And so again, you can see where this relationship is created. There really isn't a true relationship with sales, but I've broken it off from here. So again, this is placement. And so where you put the charts and how you size them and what you line them up with can really make a difference in meaning and what goes together. So going from that to kind of this other dashboard. So again, seeing kind of the original placement, you can really see now how sales was tied together to make a unit. So again, this is the original replacement. Now on to probably the most disputed part of data visualization in some ways. The one that I hear the most about is color. And so good color can make a really great dashboard. Bad color can kind of break a dashboard. That's typically what we hear. We hear a lot about, these are the colors you should use. These are the colors you shouldn't use. Naturally, I had to really experiment with this. So I went back to my dashboard, and I just hit default on everything. Now, keep in mind, if you build a dashboard in Tableau, it makes slightly different choices. When you go back and hit the default on everything, it does make other different choices. I did not change my background, but when I went back and hit default, it made my sales orange and then this blue, and I did not make any choices other than just hitting default. Normally, we take a little bit more time, but I just wanted to show you if I didn't take into account these relationships. So originally where sales had a relationship, kind of designing the charts in isolation of each other, if you will. So this is kind of what that could look like. Very jarring, very distracting, and you can see where it takes a good dashboard and really makes it hard to read. It's very distracting. So moving on from that, a lot of times I hear the vendetta against bright colors, and I don't. So I went ahead and I said, okay, I'm going to play with some bright colors. So I've got kind of a bold purple here, and I've got some blue and everything, and I also reversed it. And so this is a dark dashboard with some pretty bright colors on it. And you can see how, following linguistic principles, so I've got this gray for sales, I've got this purple for profit, and then I've got this very odd navy for the background here. So you can kind of just see what that looks like. Yes, it is bright, but it does work. And I've actually gotten a lot of feedback that people do like this iteration. It's out on the internet. I do call it purple revenge. And then moving on, typically, again, we hear that color is important and it can make or break a dashboard. But I will let you on a little secret, and I did, again, kind of play with this to look at this, and that is that you don't necessarily have to have color to make a good dashboard, that you can make a good dashboard with no color. And so I kind of did what I call the Xerox experiment, which is where I took it completely black and white. You can certainly argue that I have used a variance of cool grays and warm grays on this, but you can see the relationships are still there. You're still able to make sense of this. You do lose some of the information that was encoded just with this being a different color, but you can really see how a lot of these factors do make a dashboard. So again, you can make a good dashboard completely in grayscale. So again, just throwing color back on this, so we're going kind of Wizard of Oz, we're going back to Kansas, or actually we're leaving Kansas, and just seeing this in full Technicolor. So we can definitely see that color is important, but it may not be as important sometimes as we make it. We can certainly make a good dashboard bad with some ostentatious choices with color, but we can also make a really good dashboard with no color. So that's something to think about as you do dashboarding and you design dashboards. It's just, how do I make these strong enough? So to wrap up, and again, thank you for kind of sitting with me with these experiments. I did go through, do a lot of them. But how do we put this together? So when you look at UX and flow, to me this is kind of an evolving practice. What goes together, what doesn't go together? When you look at shape, you are already taking best practice. So when you make the chart, we're typically making charts with best practice in mind. But this is a combination of both best practice, but also making sure that the charts work together and that they're achieving the meaning that we want them to. With movement, how do we want the eye to roll through this? How do we want our user to navigate this? Placement, what is the relationship? And then finally, yes, color can set the tone literally. So I'll go ahead and turn this back over to Pat. And thank you guys for bearing with me for my experiments, and we will also take questions in the chat.
Thank you, Bridget. That was excellent. We appreciate you giving us your insight into the linguistics of data visualization and for the very interesting and helpful ideas that you shared. And for our audience, as a Tableau Gold partner, Technion is uniquely equipped to help you exceed in your BI and data analytics endeavors, as we have a team of experienced consultants who can help you. So if you believe Technion may be able to assist you with your data, you can reach us via email at events@technionusa.com or by calling us at 214-614-7600. Thank you again for investing your time with us today to listen to Brigitte Cogley's webinar on the linguistics of data visualization. And we'll keep you informed and invited to future webinar events also. For those of you who need to get back to your day, thank you again for joining us. And for any that would like to remain and interact with Brigitte in a Q&A session, we'll begin that now. Brigitte?
Thank you. And I don't have any questions yet. I will go ahead and actually jump to one question I have been asked in the past before. So just give me one moment and let me. So one question I get is that the examples that I typically show are what some tell me are pretty heavily formatted. And so I wanted to show an example that follows linguistic principles without a lot of formatting. So this is something that uses a lot of the Tableau defaults and follows the linguistic principles out there. So for example, you can see where the charts still support that Z reading. It's fairly simple. If you look at this, I've only got 5 charts on here. I do find that typically my examples usually have around 7 or 8 charts, but this again is a simple one. I've created the lines here. These 2 charts almost comprise 2 charts together. And then what I've done is I've used some hover actions as well. So as you hover over some of these items, you can see where that changes the dashboard. I did not put a cue to click here, but again, I could definitely do that as well. So you can see kind of these examples out here to where we can begin to use the linguistics model without necessarily having to heavily format. And then I would say another question I get is, for example, I personally use a lot of floating. Does it require the use of floating? So within Tableau, you can do tiled or you can do floating. I will say it's easier to do tiled, but you can certainly, I have seen a number of examples that were set to tiled and still within the linguistics model. So for those interested in learning perhaps a bit more about this, I've been blogging about this. And so give me one moment. If you're interested in learning more about this, you are welcome to go out to my blog, tableaufit.com, and click on linguistics. And there you can actually get some more posts just about these experiments. So for example, you can see where I've done this rearranging furniture. And so just talking about the way that I set things up, move things around, you can see I've kind of traced these patterns. And what does that do? So for example, just, how does the eye flow through this? How does the eye go through this? And then just being able to see these. So I do have this out here as a resource. You're welcome to use it. And then you're also welcome just to come out here and get other ideas as well. And then Technion will also be starting a blog too, so you can definitely head over to technionusa.com to also view our blog that is forthcoming. And I'm just going to double check and see if I have any additional questions. And so just bear with me. It does look like I've got some questions. And then I've got, in your experience, how do you balance user preference with best practice? So part of this is I do a lot of consulting and I do a lot of educating. I won't say that the work I do is best practice. And I know that usually surprises people, but if you look at a lot of the work that I have out on Tableau Public, there are some elements where you could argue that perhaps I include a lot of pop viz. So for example, in this example, you can see where I've got icons, I've got different things going on, I've got a lot of bubbles. So I wouldn't necessarily say that what I do is 100% best practice. You can see where I've used bubbles again for filters and just conveying KPI information. But again, I think to me what's most important is what is the message? What am I as the analyst trying to communicate to the end users? And how does whomever is going to use this dashboard best use this dashboard? I would say that's probably my driving principle. It's just making sure that it goes back to that dashboard definition of usable and actionable. And then let's see, can you create front end in a Tableau report that allows, okay, give me one moment. Can you create a front end in a Tableau report that enables the user to make selections on the data they want to see before they actually go to the viz? I have seen people use that technique before. I've also seen people, when they're doing a report factory, actually create kind of a front page of parameters and actually run reports that way. I generally don't do that very often. Typically what I try to do is more of this faceted approach. But again, it really does depend on what you're doing. But I've definitely done those in the past where it's, Again, I would call that kind of a more of a report factory where you're trying to make these reports. But typically what I try to do is less of this and even less of the small multiples, but more of kind of this, how do I build a dashboard that people interact with and get the information they need? Again, Joshua, I think, has some things on this as well. And then do I have a go-to size when I build my dashboards? If I'm not given a size, I usually start with iPad first, partly because I find that most people either have a laptop like I do, and that screen seems to work pretty well with iPad, or I also have a number of people nowadays that are beginning to access these through their iPad. And then, let's see, do you have a link that will allow you to quickly determine how people with color blindness might interpret this? I don't have a link. I do know if you Google it, you'll come up with about 1 million options, and some of them will allow you to plug in a JPEG and actually allow you to see those variances. And then is this something you consider? For the most part, having an interpreting background, I actually avoid the color red, partly because I used to have clientele with blindness, and there's a certain type of blindness that actually makes the color red physically painful. And so after learning the hard way, I actually just generally avoid red for the most part. I tend to favor a lot of blues. I do sometimes a lot more natural and tan shades. And then every now and then you'll notice some of my work is green. And again, I usually try to make sure that green is kind of tinged with a blue shade. And then would you consider a command center design against best practice since it defines the Z-reading tendency? So to me, Z-reading is one of many ways. And so for example, when I go to Tableau Gallery, I actually have a number of dashboards that break this convention, in particular this one. So this is a dashboard that I use a lot, kind of this setup, to sometimes cue the reader. Here's this. So I've got, part one, which is this is read this first, then go here. So I wouldn't necessarily say Z-reading is the only. It's kind of the default. But again, sometimes I intentionally break that because I want you to look at something first and say, okay, well, I've got this. If I click on this, then this part changes and this part changes. So it's all in how do I want to show that information. So Z being default, but then also knowing how to break that. But as far as a command center, especially when dealing with interactivity, it's very rare for me to put interactivity in the middle. And so I have certain ways of going about this where I'll tend to put a lot of interactivity at the front because I want that to reflex down here. And then have you experienced different Tableau styles for people who have a different native language? Yes, actually. And there's a lot from a cultural standpoint. So we tend to read from left to right. If you work with certain Asian cultures, there's a preference more towards down. So looking at that, how do I build down? But then again, being able to cue with things like containers and just different ways of kind of formatting a dashboard to show people, okay, go here. So there is a level of control that you have as the analyst. All right, well, it is 1:55. If there is no other questions, I do want to thank you guys very much for taking your time out. I know you guys have very busy days. Again, down on the blog, you're also welcome to comment. If you're not out there on the Tableau community, you'll find a lot of people out on Twitter. So if you just join Twitter and then look for hashtag Tableau or at Tableau, you'll find a lot of your Tableau people are out there, including myself and Joshua Milligan. So thank you guys very much.